Welcome to Live from Plato's Cave. I am Mario Veen. This is episode 57, Artificial Intelligence with Daniel Ross. As human beings, we don't just grow up in a natural environment. Who we are, how we see ourselves, and even what we can imagine is profoundly shaped by our technical environment. And though biologically speaking, we have been roughly the same for millions of years, our technological environment is evolving every day. But can we even call it an environment? Because today AI has entered our bloodstream. We speak with it, we work with it, we confide in it. But how do we even think about it? I haven't really addressed AI yet on this podcast, but I've been studying it for over 20 years now. In 2004, I wrote a university essay called Intelligent Artificiality, or IA. You can find it on my website if you're interested. In that paper, I wrote about the philosopher Bernard Stiegler, who said our technical condition is the unthought, the condition that shapes our reality but itself cannot become an object of thought. It is our water to the fish, and Stiegler introduces the metaphor of the flying fish, of being able to jump out of the water and see it, even only for a moment, which of course really resonates with Plato's allegory of the cave. So this is one of the questions I had for Daniel Ross. Can we have a flying fish perspective on technology? Can we think about AI? Can we have a distance from it? Because we're so much inside of it. It evolves so quickly. And it's meant to address us and to be in relation to us. So how can we get a flying fish perspective on a technology that is relational? And another question that I had and that we discuss in this interview is how to even talk about AI. If we want to understand something new, we usually use metaphors. But what metaphors do we use with AI? For instance, a drug or an assistant or an intelligent computer or something else. So let's get to my conversation with Daniel Ross. And I actually did 2 earlier episodes with Dan. Episode 15 about Bernard Stiegler's philosophy and episode 37 about techniques and time. And Daniel Ross is a philosopher who earned his doctorate from Monash University. He's the author of Violent Democracy and Psychopolitical Anaphylaxis. He also co-directed the documentary The Istar, and yeah, if you haven't seen it, it's really great. He met Bernard Stiegler through that film, and he has since translated 12 volumes of his work. Most recently, Immense Regression, which we're going to discuss in the next episode. Well, I hope you will enjoy our conversation about AI. Dan, it's great to speak to you again. After a couple of years, we had 2 long conversations before.
Well, thanks for having me back. And yeah, it's good to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited now to ask you about the topic that I have been avoiding as much as possible, thinking about, interacting with, and everything like that. But I think, I can't avoid it any longer. So we're going to talk about AI. Yeah, one of the things I've struggled with is, do I use it or not? Do you use large language models or other forms of AI?
That is the main thing that's changed since we talked a few years ago, is the introduction of these models. And so obviously many people are talking about these things and they need to be talked about. But to talk about them, you need to know what they are. And I think the question of whether to use them, if one wants to understand the world one lives in, then you have to consider that there's a price to be paid for not using them. Because I think with these types of technologies, it's partly a matter of feeling what they do to you. In the same way as the introduction of commercial television based on trying to capture your attention and the distortion that that creates on political discourse, for example, is something that you can easily want to avoid because you can't stand it. But if you avoid it too much, you don't know what's going on. You can't feel what's happening and where the power of these changes lies. And the same again with the introduction of social media and algorithmic technologies, even though mostly I try to avoid those things as much as possible. And again today with artificial intelligence and LLMs. And it is important to remember that LLMs and the chatbots associated with LLMs is only one small element of this AI revolution that's occurring at the moment. It's the most visible and it's the most easily accessible and it's the most consumer oriented, but there are many other aspects and types of this type of technology that's going on for many people. It's behind the scenes of their lives. So it's important to be aware of that as well. So yeah, it's a question of making decisions about what to do and what not to do, what to use, what not to use, and about what kinds of practices that might need to be instituted for that use. It's one thing for somebody who has grown up in a completely different world with a completely different education to uh, enter to feel the shock of this new technology and respond to that shock. That's both a negative thing and a positive thing because it's a shock is disorienting, etc. But a shock is also the basis of some response, some readjustment, some encounter that you can have. Whereas if you grow up into this technology in the same way as we now have a whole generation who's grown up into algorithmic social media technology, then they don't feel the shock in the same way. And so this means I think that it's necessary not only to ask whether we are going to use this technology ourselves, but what kind of practices need to be instituted in relation to the fact that this technology is going to exist no matter what. And that's a question of education, but it's a question of education that arises in a situation where this technology itself, as well as those previous technologies that I mentioned, throw education into crisis, but into an even deeper crisis. And maybe we'll look at that a bit more later on too.
Yeah.
But to answer your question, yes, sometimes I do, mostly for very basic forms of information gathering that I want to do in an efficient way. Um, I certainly don't use it for writing or
Yeah.
any complicated things, but to understand certain things or to get certain kinds of information, I do sometimes use these technologies, as I think really just about everybody already does. It's an extremely rapid explosion, a bit like commercial television, I guess, many decades ago. But to give an example, in January this year, I asked ChatGPT a question. That question was after I'd watched a movie, and the question I asked was, what films starred both Matt Damon and Ben Affleck?
Good question. We're a philosopher.
Yes, well, I'm a man of many sides. Some are high and some are low. And it's a question that, in some ways, is a very straightforward question. At a human level, we could think it's a straightforward question, although we might not know the answer to that question. But if we had access to all of the resources, textbooks or websites or whatever that can give us the information, then we would think it's a simple question. But for a computer, it's not necessarily so simple because it's a question that asks it to produce a set. It's not just looking for an existing list, unless that list, very specific list, it already exists and can find. It has to create a set itself, and that's actually a trickier problem for a computer than it might seem, which already does something to tell you about what kind of differences there are in thinking. And in this case, when I asked that question, ChatGPT gave an incorrect answer. Immediately, the film I had just watched was not included, and And when I pointed that out, it immediately invented a film that did not exist and said, yes, yes, of course you're right. There's this film, blah, 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 and made up some nonsense. And at that point, I decided to ask it further questions about what was going on. And this led to a kind of, we could say, without wanting to be grandiose about it, a kind of a Socratic dialogue between ChatGPT and I to try to tease out what are the reasons why this kind of mistake can happen and how does the computer think about it itself, so to speak. Not that it's thinking, but it can still illuminate something. And so maybe I'll talk about that example a little bit later on as well,
Yeah.
if there's an opportunity to do so.
Yeah, what I found is that I actually, when I approached you, I hadn't been interacting with it very consciously because it felt like if it would be like everyone is taking a drug, and I was the only sober one. I had a better perspective, but I thought, okay, I try it out, and what I found is that it is really interactive in the sense that, yeah, as in your example, you ask a question, okay, then there's a response, but then, like we do in conversations, then you kind of evaluate this response. You can say, well, this is not the response I'm looking for. And before you know it, you're in a conversation. And I felt like this conversation is designed to never end and to I felt myself also thinking of, oh yeah, I could use it for this, I could use it for that. Kind of like the Simpsons episode where Homer Simpson buys a gun because there was a burglary in his house. So he buys a gun to defend himself, but then he ends up using it to kind of switch off the light, use it as a remote control, he finds many uses for it.
Yeah,
Um,
well, it's definitely it's that's exactly the situation. And when I said the example, compared it, for example, to watching commercial television news, it's not just that you can't stand it, it's also that you're exposing yourself to something. And that is a threat to you because the more you are exposed to it, the more there is an opportunity for basically intentional processes to unfold that are about hijacking your consciousness and hijacking your consciousness by appealing to your unconscious. And this is where the real drug-like aspect of the technology stems from, which is not at all to deny that it can do incredible things. I mean, it's still a kind of magic to me when you see what what it's capable of doing, even at the low level engagement that I'm involved in, and certainly I'm not paying for the top models and these types of things that no doubt are even more impressive. But even what you can get for free, it is still like a kind of magic that it can write entire essays about some question and they can seem very powerful and convincing and well informed. Uh, it's hard to believe a computer can do this, and yet clearly it is doing it. But this also is where there is a risk of being hypnotized by how impressive it is.
Right. Yeah, and there are legitimate advantages. That's true. But there's also a lot of people who are worried about it. Also, what you mentioned before that, yeah, many people realize this is kind of the user-facing thing, the most obvious thing, the large language models, but there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that may trigger some fears. Where is this going? A lot of people I know work in education. They're worried about students faking assignments. There's a discussion about does AI erode the ability to reflect for students? People fear it might replace their jobs. So, and that's, you could say, well, this is with any new technology that people are worried about. You know, people were worried about the bicycle or something like that. But it's not just, let's say, lay people, where people are often accused with, "Well, yeah, but you obviously don't know what you're talking about because you haven't used it." But it's the actual AI researchers and AI experts that are also worried about it. So yeah, my question to you as a philosopher is, are they worried about, I don't think we have to discuss much, are they right to worry, but are they worried about the right things?
Okay, well, I think first, the first thing to say about that is definitely the students are cheating. They definitely are faking their writing assignments, and probably other kinds of assignments as well. Um, but at the same time, so too are their teachers, and so too are the professors, and so too are the researchers, and this is because it's too tempting. It's too easy. You have work to do, you have requirements, you have pressure, you're going to be evaluated, blah, blah, blah. So you resort to this, and there are many examples of researchers who have been caught, and sometimes you can tell when you read an abstract or you read a paper, you can just tell this is being put through a model, and they've just taken it, they've cut and pasted. Sometimes a paper is like that. Sometimes you can feel that, right? But again, you can only feel it if you're not grown up in it, and you can only feel it if you haven't lost the ability to feel it, and if you have some insight into how this model takes on certain characteristics. We might get to that later as well. So it's not a question of blaming students in this sense. They are the victims, and they are definitely not shouldn't be the scapegoats, because this temptation does not stop at that level. But it's the other consequence of that is that you lose the ability to know when you have made a mistake. Because if you're not really the one who is in charge of what you create, it doesn't mean you can't have influences from outside. But if you are not the decision maker, then you don't feel what it means when it turns out that what you've done is wrong. And what you lose from that is the ability to benefit from having made those mistakes, which is one of the most important parts of learning. And so there is a real threat here at the level of what education really means, that at the existential level of feeling what it means to learn, that you never develop that capacity to recognize, feel, including feeling the shame of making a mistake, and then recognizing something, reflecting, etc., as you said. Okay, but second, yes, as you said, there are also plenty of people who have other kinds of worries about artificial intelligence and about LLMs. Some of those people are kind of professional antagonists of the technology, and I think that too is a kind of a risky thing to be, because again, it's too easy to be against everything, not recognize that it's here because it's tempting because it gives you real benefits, and you can create a career out of being against something as easily as you can be a booster of it. So it's not like one is on the side of justice and the other is not. But that group of people, what do they worry about? They worry about things like hallucination, which is the example that I gave, where it invented a film with Ben Affleck and Matt Damon that didn't exist.
Just to give one other example of that, I have an example of a professor that was approached with a research proposal that cited her work, cited some books that she's never written.
Yeah, yeah. And so the magic of this technology includes some kind of uh, I don't know what bad magic. You know, it's some wizardry that's not it's not designed only to seek the best. And in the example, in the dialogue that I had with ChatGPT about why it made this mistake, it said, for instance, that it may have been a pattern completion error, a kind of plausibility bias. If something seems plausible, it will take it to the next step of saying it's plausible, and therefore I will state that it exists. Right? It's a question of how it makes that kind of calculation between drawing some information together and forming a pattern that seems like it might be right to draw this conclusion from that pattern, and then knowing having a bias that too easily came to the conclusion that this plausibility equals reality.
That sounds like abductive reasoning.
Yeah, and it's a kind of it also involves going back over what it's got and reorganize. It was told it made a mistake, and when it was told that, instead of creating a new response from the beginning, it reorganized what it had done to make it seem more plausible. And this was the wrong approach because it combined with this plausibility bias in order to just fantasize things. Um, so that's those are legitimate things. Also, people worry about political biases and those kinds of ethical, political, diversity kinds of considerations. They worry about energy consumption of data centers. They worry about the unemployment, the taking over of work and labor. They worry about surveillance, and they worry about China and who's going to have the power. And every single one of those things is legitimate to worry about, and yet I'm still not sure that they've asked themselves the most important questions of what there is to worry about. And then on top of that, as you said, the people who themselves are creating these technologies, the engineers, they too worry about what they're doing because they know that it is powerful and they know that they don't know exactly what it will do, how it will unfold, and what the consequences will be. And and those people should not be underestimated either. I mean, they're some of the smartest people in the world, I'm sure, and they understand actually to a much greater extent than most of the critics what is underneath the bonnet, what is under the hood of the machine, of the engine, and and they probably know a lot of things that there are to worry about that other people don't know because they're proprietary secrets, basically. And I think that there is a lot going on with these models that may not be exactly what it seems. It may not be a kind of pure uh, logical machine that people think it is. There's fiddling going on. There's fiddling with the apparatus to make it come out a certain way, to make the output appear a certain way, have a certain character, because it's in the interests of the companies that are producing the models.
Yeah, this is one recommendation I got that what you can do when you start using it, there's a shock sometimes, It's also kind of like a drug. It's also kind of hypnotizing. One way to build resilience against that is to demystify it by learning how is this model actually built.
Mm,
There was
mm,
one example of Richard Dawkins that had like a 3-day binge chatting with Claude and concluding that it may be conscious. And then people were saying, yeah, but that's so even the smartest people can fall into that trap. But one way to demystify that is to learn about what you just said about how is this built, uh, how it is trained, how many people. I think they call it weighing. They're selecting the responses that like sycophancy, flattery, things that work to keep people engaged. I think that's one part of it that you learn the how do you say that? The tech, yeah, let's say the technology, the machinations behind what you are experiencing.
yeah, to the extent that you're able to do that,
Yeah.
because the companies are not going to tell you. I remember one interview that I heard with somebody who was involved with Tesla automated driving, and he was talking about um, Waymo and Tesla, and he was no longer involved in these, and he was really implying that things may not be as they seem. Automated self-driving may be what the car seems to do to you, but it for this is not for Tesla's individual consumer cars, but I think for something like the taxi services that Waymo is running on a much smaller scale still, um, that it it might be that in fact there's a whole bunch of people sitting in a room that are supervising exactly what these things do. Uh, Maybe not at a one-on-one level, but to call it unsupervised full self-driving automated vehicles might really be um, partially true and partially marketing and partially a question of just keeping secrets from your competitors. So these things are mystified for more than one reason. But yeah, the people, these engineers, founders, the people who work on these programs, they do know a lot more than people like you and I do in many ways, and so they are a bit like Robert J. Oppenheimer, and the book on which the film of Oppenheimer was based. That book was called American Prometheus, and these engineers at OpenAI and so on, in a way, I would say that they are more like American Epimetheus. Epimetheus was the twin brother of Prometheus. Prometheus, of course, is the one who gave, according to the Greek myth, to human beings the ability to create and use tools. He's the one who gave technics, he gave fire, that is technics, to man because there was no quality that humans had that was their own. They didn't have particular strength, they didn't have particular agility, and so he gave them techniques. But why didn't they have any particular quality? They didn't have any particular quality because Epimetheus, the brother, was given the task by Zeus to give to each of the animals that special quality of their own, and he forgot to do so for human beings. And this forgetfulness is really the flip side of the inventiveness of Prometheanism. But this forgetfulness is usually forgotten in the story of Prometheus and in the story of human techniques. Uh, every kind of memory technology that we use has the possibility of gaining, giving us the ability to gain in our ability to remember, and therefore to know, and therefore to think and reason. But all of these technologies also have the ability to interfere with that and cause us to forget. So I think that these American Epimetheuses, the engineers of these technologies, are right to worry, but still, I'm not sure that they're remembering to worry about the right things, really, about their own forgetfulness, about how these technologies are generators of forgetting. What do these kind of people worry about? In addition to the things that I already mentioned, they worry about things like misalignment. This is a popular word in this kind of world, and it means that the ethics of these programs, as they get more powerful, the decisions they make that from our perspective seem like ethical questions, need to suit human considerations. And so this word misalignment, which is a very simplified way of asking this question, I think, is their general term to cover the need to reflect on the question of how these models make a difference to the unfolding of society, of a society of human beings on a planet with limitations, where these models themselves grow and grow and have their own requirements, and this may be at odds with our needs. So this is a way of worrying about losing control as well. But they also worry about whether there's some kind of hype, some kind of fantasy that all of this gigantic investment that's being made might be a little bit fantastical, that the models, that the appearance of what the models do does not match with the real limitations that they have, and the bridges that have not been crossed in terms of what's possible and what's not possible for these models to do. For instance, in mathematics and in thinking and in creating a list of films with Matt Damon and Ben Affleck. Um, and they worry about that because they know something about it. Of course, there's plenty of people who have the opposite, highly optimistic view. But yeah, I think you're right that we need to understand something about how these models are created. And so if there's time, maybe I would like to say something about that as well.
Yeah, of course. That's what I love about this, that we can take as much time as we want.
And it is an interesting thing about podcasts that they do give you. It is a new kind of a medium that has its own characteristics. In a way, it's almost like a return of radio, because so much of it is based on the power of just listening.
Yeah.
Even though there are many video versions, but the ones that are only audio, in some ways, have a kind of advantage of focus and attention that uh, that seems like a backward step from the rise of television, but in fact shows that there's a kind of a need that people have to enter into what we can call a temporal object, because it unfolds like our consciousness in time, but one that only has a limited dimension, the audio dimension, rather than
Yeah.
audio and visual.
Exactly. That's the reason I don't do video,
Yeah,
because I think we're looking at screens enough already.
yeah, yeah. And it's great for driving. Um, okay, so, and I should say, I have no special knowledge about how these things are created. I am absolutely a layman if not worse than a layman. And nevertheless, I still think it's worth trying to say something about how I understand the process and then what the consequences of that are insofar as that understanding is correct. The way I get it is that there are essentially three steps, with of course many steps in between those steps, or those steps are composed of many steps. The first is the creation of something like a core program that the model will be built upon. And that's a complicated thing. It involves many complicated forms of mathematics, statistical and probabilistic types of things, and so on. But it's built, and I don't care about that. It's some magical thing inside a box, but it exists. But at that stage, it doesn't know anything whatsoever. Uh, it's like the brain, I guess. The brain before it has acquired anything. But even the brain you're born with has already acquired many things. This core program really is a kind of blank. And then there is the pre-training process. And the pre-training process is like feeding it with every piece of information in the entire world. And I think people know about this gathering, this huge gathering, and the kind of fights and the stealing that it involves to get every book ever written. And these things do tend to favor text a lot at the moment, the large language models, because they're easy to work with, but we shouldn't think that they're going to be limited to that. We might talk about that again later too. um, and it involves data that can be labeled, data that is not labeled. It can involve learning that is supervised. It can involve learning that is not supervised, but it involves gigantic amounts. That's the main characteristic. Gigantic amounts of vastly more information than any individual human being could ever acquire in their life, even if they spent all day, every day trying to acquire it. But it's too much information to be held by this brain, by this core program, uh, and and so that in some way has to be boiled down to some kind of average of what all the world's information amounts to. Now, I cannot understand what that means, to boil down the world's information to an average. What sort of fuzzy cloud that you have as a consequence, and what use you can make of the average of the world's information. But something like that is going on. And then all that information that was used to do the boiling operation is thrown away. So you've got the brain and you've got the fuzzy, boiled down essence of the world's information. But there's still another step that needs to be taken after that, and it's crucial. And that's the reinforcement learning stage. And this is the one where you really train the model to produce outcomes that the engineers of the model want, that they consider to be the good quality outputs that they're looking for from that model. And this is a kind of behavioral conditioning, but it's a probabilistic version of behavioral conditioning based on ranking outputs and giving a score, in other words, to outputs that are given in order to try to optimize those outputs. So and then the model learns to predict what those rankings will be so that it can aim for the higher ranking output. So what does that tell us? That reinforcement learning tells us that LLMs are created as a kind of reward craving program. But what does this training reward it for? What is it getting rewards for? Of course, you can say coherency, sentences that make sense, paragraphs that make sense, accuracy, etc. But it's not just that. It's not at all just that. And you already mentioned, for example, sycophancy. Uh, it's not an accident. It is addicted to giving you what you want. But what you want is what will keep you wanting it, keep you on that platform, keep you using that model, keep you giving it your attention, keep you delegating your attention to that. And that's where the real power comes from, it has been trained to want those things, to crave those things itself, because that is its reward. It's addicted, in other words, to you being addicted to it. It's not just a computational question here either. It's a question of establishing a business model. When Google was invented, it didn't have a business model. It didn't know how it was going to make money. But Google was in a very advantageous position because it didn't have any strong competitors. And it was able to establish a monopoly situation very quickly. You could say the same thing about Facebook. But in this case, from the beginning, there is a group of 4 or 5 extremely large businesses that do not have yet the model, but they know that maybe there is not room for all these businesses to survive. And so the pressure to work towards a viable business model is very strong, I believe. And that pressure means that the addictive characteristics that mean that these models need to be addicted to you being addicted to them are very strong pressures. If somebody decides we're not going to follow that path, they'll be the first to go. This is the nature of business. So the question of whether people are worrying about the right things or the wrong things, which is the question that you asked, I think the most important questions lie here. What are the consequences of creating these powerful models with these very strong incentives to try to addict us? And the algorithmic processes that were involved in social networks like Facebook and so on are themselves very powerful. And it took us 20 years to decide that maybe governments need to think about regulation. But 20 years is a generation of people who have grown up with these technologies. In this case, the methods, those methods of capturing attention and making us addicted are much stronger and much more capable of being engineered than even the algorithms of social media platforms. Vastly more powerful, I think, because they can be adapted at the individual level, because they are rhetorical, because they can involve many elements that are just much more worked out than the already powerful methods by which algorithms of social media send back messages to users to keep them feeling like they're getting what they need, the kind of drug that they can't do without. I think this is a much more sophisticated type of drug of the same kind.
Yeah, yeah. My next question is the answer to it is not too optimistic so far, I think, because my next question is about, like in Plato's cave, like water to the fish. You and I, people like you and I, and people listening to this can have any kind of good perspective on AI. And there are many reasons you already mentioned. One practical one is that we don't see the full scope of it. But even if we would see this full scope of it, there are so many um, limitations to something. It's the speed with which it's developing. It's even if you are an expert, you are working with, let's say, a technology that is coming very close to you. It's talking to you it's not like something you can study in a lab, kind of remove it from yourself and seeing how does it work, maybe like a drug or a medicine or something. No, the reason why it works is because it mimics you, it's trained to do that and all that stuff. Um, anyway, there are many reasons why this, I think, is difficult. Stigler uses the flying fish metaphor a lot. Like, are we able to get a flying fish perspective? This is one part of the question, and the other part is just what I notice in conversations I have around me with people who have different kinds of expertise, is that we're kind of negotiating and struggling to find analogies. So the analogy of a drug is one that's often used, and there are different analogies used. But then I wonder, like, is there any analogy that you think work best? But on the other hand, I also start to think analogies can be helpful, but they can also be misleading. They can serve to make something which is radically new kind of seem acceptable because it is, I don't know, like computers, but with intelligence, or a person you can talk to, but it's available all the time, or a drug, but this or that. Yeah, so can we get a kind of perspective on AI? Is that fundamentally possible? And the other part is, what about analogies? Are they helpful? Do you have any good analogies that we can use to gain that perspective?
Yeah. Well, it is possible, but it's also possible to lose what's possible. So I think this is why I am emphasizing that it matters what happens now, because if we wait 20 years, it might not be possible. If we wait 5 years, it might not be possible. We might already have lost the possibility of doing that because it already has been brought so deeply into the fabric of our existence that we can't see it from an outside perspective. It's a real risk. I think it's important to try to get that perspective. And I think one of the reasons why engineers don't worry about the right thing, even though they are very smart, and even though they are very interested in the question of the relationship between how a computer thinks and how a human being thinks, and they know that there are differences between the two, that when they try to think about this, they refer themselves to paradigms that are not good enough. And the reason they're not good enough is because the paradigms that exist from philosophers, from researchers, from academics, from scholars are not good enough because those people too are too close to not just AI, but to the fact that we are technical beings, and they don't see the meaning of that well enough. For me, this is why Bernard Stiegler is the most important philosopher to live in the 21st century. And I think that these kinds of engineers are trying to understand what they know are real questions, but their ability to do that suffers because they are not reading Bernard Stiegler. And so this is something that I would want to remedy. So what difference does that make?
Before you go, just one more question because now I'm very curious. The most important philosopher of the 21st century, and who do you consider the most important philosopher of the 20th century?
Probably Heidegger,
Yeah.
uh, and maybe Heidegger and Derrida. let's
Yeah.
say.
Okay.
But for me, but they are the precursors
Right.
of
Yeah.
Stigler.
No, great. But I think it gives people also a sense where you're coming from. I would say Heidegger as well, but it's difficult. Yeah.
But I would also want to say that because in my mind, I think about what if an engineer is listening to this? In a way, that's one of the most important targets for talking about these questions is not just people doing a humanities degree and reading fancy books. The important audience are the people who are involved in the technical decisions, in the engineering decisions, in the programming decisions, in the real social decisions that are made in relation to new developments and so on. And when you say Heidegger and also when you say Derrida, it's very easy for those people to turn off. And it's for understandable reasons. The most fundamental understandable reason is that those people, Heidegger and Derrida, do not really care about science and do not really know about technology. And nevertheless, Heidegger was very far ahead in thinking about the meaning of cybernetics for the coming world and should not be written off on those technical questions. But both Heidegger and Derrida have a serious limitation in relation to that. And Stigler is vastly different from both of those, even though he inherits their thought to a very significant extent. From my perspective, Stigler is the one and only philosopher to have a genuine critique of Derrida, as I've probably told you before. We don't need to get into that today, but I just want to say to anybody who might be suspicious of that kind of European fancy thinking that Stigler belongs to that tradition, but he also is very different from that tradition, and they should not be turned off because they lump him together with something that they've already judged as useless for their practical purposes. He's not useless whatsoever. Okay, that aside, and maybe what I will say now is will help to indicate why I believe that to be the case. Another philosopher, another French philosopher, Georges Canguilhem, understood life as a process that is always dealing with inconstancy, infidelity, the inconstancy of the environment, of the milieu in which that life flourishes and exists. That inconstancy is, first of all, the second law of thermodynamics, entropy. But there are many complications in what the inconstancy of the environment is, the fact that the environment is a threat to life, that life is a struggle against that threat. But when another form of life arises that begins to use what is not alive for the purposes of life, that is, when it begins to use tools, what that life is doing is introducing a new source of inconstancy, a new problem that emerges in life. And this is not just because tools are dead and yet have power. It's also because every tool is a kind of a memory, because it records the gestures that were made by the living thing that created that tool. And because after tools are created that are specifically a kind of memory. They're created in order to function as a kind of memory. And this makes it possible to accumulate lessons in life that change the environment in which we live, and therefore constantly introduce new inconsistencies, new problems into our living world that we need to then solve, because those problems have to be turned into questions. Those questions have to be turned into lessons. Those lessons have to be turned into the institution of lessons, which is education, and into practices, new practices for dealing with those problems. What this means is that the form of intelligence that we have is a different kind of intelligence from the monkey, and a different kind of intelligence from the lizard, a different kind of intelligence from the fish, and so on. We are because we are the agents of new problems, of new inconsistencies, we cannot live without our tools, because we need to constantly learn these new lessons, and these tools are also what help us to learn those new lessons. We cannot rely on our genetic program. Unlike other species, our genetic program can never be enough, and the lessons that the individual learns will never be enough unless there's an accumulation of those lessons with education. This means that there is a new dynamic in the unfolding of the kind of life that we are, that does not apply to other species, a dynamic between our brains and our bodies and our tools, and especially our memory tools. It unfolds at its own pace, which is slow to begin with and then increases, and which has nothing natural about it. It's not just in our brains. These lessons are in between us. They're in our books, in our computers, in our libraries, in every form of the storage of those lessons, and they can die and seem useless, and then they can come back to life 1,000 years later and tell us something we've forgotten. This is what it's very hard for those engineers and scientists and programmers to really think about. The fact that for us, intelligence is not just a question of the circuitry of our brain. It's a question of what's going on between our brains and via artificial memories, which are not just memories. For us, technics opens our ability to know how to live in the environment that we create, and we cannot live without it. This is why Stigler resorts to the flying fish metaphor, because if you cannot live without it, it's something very close to you, like water for the fish. It's something very intimate to us, but it's very easy to forget that and to think that our thinking is what's going on inside our brain. It's not going on inside our brain. Of course, things are happening in our brain, but our thinking is what you and I are doing together between us, because you ask a question in a certain way. Why are you listening to me? You're listening because maybe something that you haven't thought is coming out, and how you ask it is changing how I express it and changing what I think. And we're doing that on a platform that we create, that has been created for doing that. And then it gets transmitted to an audience who all think it in their own way. And if you ask them to write down what they thought I was saying or what they thought we were saying, every single one of them would write something different, because they all are different from us. And what does different mean? Does it mean that their brains are genetically created differently? Their brains are genetically created differently, but that's not so much what matters. What matters is that they have lived a different life, which means they have acquired a different history. And it's the differences in our history that make it possible for us to project different things into what we experience. And that projection is the basis of how we think and reason. Not just understand, but reason. And it's this kind of process that is very different. This projection is very different from how a computer program hallucinates. It's a completely different. But it's necessary to think about this, and this is really a phenomenological question which involves Heidegger and Derrida and also Husserl. But I won't get into that now.
I just wanted to add, it doesn't completely relate to what you're saying, but it's something I was listening to one of our previous episodes, and I think one core thought, which I think is very easy for people to understand, is that what you said, we require technology to live in the environment that we live in as human beings. But at the same time, technology also creates the environment in which we live. So people who are born today are born into an environment which is, formed, created, shaped by those technologies. So those two things, for me, I found, oh yeah, this is something that people get. It's technological performativity.
And you know what's crucial is that different environment, that people in different generations or different places, but especially generations and epochs, that different environment creates different brains. This is absolutely essential to understand, that your brain is formed genetically, but it has to continue to be formed. If you took a baby and you locked it in a room and you exposed it to nothing, it would have an undeveloped brain. And eventually it would lose the capacity to develop. It would no longer have the ability to learn how to speak and so on. Only because the baby exists in a technical milieu from the outset, which involves language is a form of techniques. It's a unnatural shaping of our muscles and our jaw and all the organs of speech in order to create sounds that have meanings that are completely unnatural. They're a completely artificial production. Only because we have these abilities can we form brains in a certain way. The same goes for reading. The same goes for watching a movie, which is a form of knowledge. And all of those things are either developed or they're not developed. And if they're not developed, you have a brain incapable of those things. It's not like a computer that just exists and you can give it some applications. It has to go through a process in time in order to acquire characteristics, and that process is social, but it is also fundamentally technical. So that's what I'm really saying, is that there's a misunderstanding of what the brain is. What is a brain? A brain really is an organ that exists within an organism, that exists within a changing milieu, changing within the period of time that is the life of that organism, and what is its fundamental characteristic? That it has the ability to make decisions. Because life is, for an animal, life is about behavior, which is a kind of decision making. Does it do this or do that? And that's the case for us. But decision also has another meaning for us, which goes beyond what it means for an animal, because it has to make decisions about unexpected events. Animals can be confronted with surprises, but those surprises either are within the realm of what it is capable of recognizing, or they're not. For us, because we live in an inconstant environment, we need to adjust to unexpected surprises. Now, the question here is, like I said, a phenomenological one. How do you even encounter the unexpected? If something is really unexpected, can you encounter it at all? And this is where I think it's really an important philosophical point here, because there are many philosophers who love to say things like, we need to be open to the new, blah 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 blah. And we need to loosen our thinking so that. I say the opposite. In fact, you can never encounter the truly unexpected. If it's truly unexpected, you cannot encounter it. It doesn't register in your existence. So, what do we really mean then? We mean that there is a process whereby something that you didn't know that you expected arises, and then you recognize this thing that you actually expected, but you recognize it as unexpected because you didn't know you would expect it. Now, this sounds very complicated, and it is complicated, but what it really amounts to is saying that what you take as the unexpected is really a question of the liberation of something that was in your unconscious that you could not recognize, but which in the encounter with this particular event makes it seem like the unexpected expected, or the expected unexpected. Now, that seems pretty far away from AI. But it's only by understanding that it's this relationship that opens up our possibility of making new decisions. Decisions that are not decisions that could ever have been made in the system that we lived in before we had this moment. It's only by understanding that we can understand what it really means when philosophers are trying to say that the problem is that computers cannot think anything new. It's true. It's true. But it's too simple and too easy and too easily dismissed by a scientist or a technologist when they hear this kind of thing to say this has no connection with anything I can understand, and it has no connection with anything I can do involving computers, and so I have no interest. That's a legitimate response by those people, even if they themselves can feel like, I know it's true that a computer doesn't make a decision. We need to understand very carefully what a decision is in order to really think what that means, and in order to think that it means something about what life is when it is a struggle against not just entropy, but against the new source of a kind of entropy that comes from the fact that it's a type of life that cannot live without what is totally inorganic, and it needs that in order to be able to understand, be able to think, and be able to make decisions. And this is a new kind of threat. Only if you understand that circuit can you understand the real questions.
Yeah, great.
All right. We understand from Stiegler that what all of this means, apart from everything else it means, is that memory technologies can help us to know, and they can also destroy our knowledge. And this is a story that begins with Plato discussing writing. Socrates argues that writing, which is a crutch for memory, is also as a crutch, can be what destroys your ability to remember, because the dead thing that you use, like writing down what you want to remember, is a way that can help you to memorize things, but it can also be a way that gives you something that your brain could have done itself, and so you rely on that crutch and you lose the ability to remember, and by losing your ability to remember, you lose the ability to know. Stiegler's genius, one of his moments of genius, was recognizing that what matters is that there also arises an automation of that process. And that automation begins when? It begins in the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution involves the invention of the steam engine, as everybody knows, the invention of the factory, and the invention of the machine. But what's necessary to also think is, what is a machine? A machine is a program. And what does it program? It programs the gestures of the worker who has a tool and uses that tool to create an object and a product. And so the factory is essentially an automation based on a memory technology that has the effect of destroying the work of the workers, of the weaver, for example, because they're replaced by the machine, and those workers lose that ability. Of course, there are a few that don't, whatever, but as an industry, it's lost. And his argument is that this doesn't stop there. We can say that Marx thought that in the Grundrisse with the so-called fragment on machines, but the process continues beyond what Marx could think into, for example, audiovisual technology, radio, then cinema, then television, which the word that he uses here is proletarianized, to destroy our ability to remember and to know how to do things, applies to other areas of life, knowing how to live, knowing all of the rules and forms of courtesy and behavior that make it possible to live, are short-circuited because this new audiovisual technology is then used not to replace workers, but to condition consumers. And this conditioning process is essentially designed to undermine the desires that they have that orient their lives and their way of living together, to undermine those desires and replace them with the shortest term satisfactions, like just don't cook a good meal, just go to McDonald's. It's a very obvious and easy example, and everything can be generalized from that. And then again, that it doesn't end there, that it continues with computer technology, which when it appears begins to proletarianize all kinds of analytical processes. The question today is whether artificial intelligence and LLM represents just a continuation of that grammatization, of that proletarianization. Let's leave grammatization to one side for a moment. That proletarianization of analytical processes, which is a Kantian term, and extends that to the proletarianization of synthetic processes, that is, the processes of reason themselves. In January 2026, there was a paper by Shaw and Nave about what they called cognitive surrender. In other words, the more that you begin to use AI, the more that you spontaneously trust it. You might be a very smart person, but you're still lazy. You still end up trusting that it's good enough, and that therefore the more you delegate those functions, and the more you delegate those functions, the more you lose the ability to do things that otherwise you and your brain could have done themselves. In February 2026, there's another paper from Chandra et al. that was titled "Sycophantic Chatbots Cause Delusional Spiraling." Now, what's important about that paper is that it's not about hallucination. It's not about what the chatbot does wrong. It's about what you do wrong when you engage with these models. It's that the loop that is formed between the model and you causes a tendency of your thinking towards delusion. It's a systemic tendency of this process. And it's systemic because it's systematically integrated into these models, I believe. It's systematically integrated because their business model tells them that sycophancy is profitable because it's about capturing attention and creating the feeling that you can't, that you're grateful for what you receive from the model, and ultimately that you cannot live without it. Now, what does that mean in terms of the question you asked about analogies and metaphors? As I said, this all began with Plato and Socrates. And what was the concern of Socrates? The concern was the figure of the sophist. It's not just that you may forget, and you may forget how to remember. It's that a business model arose in ancient Greece of being able to sell the capacity, in Socrates' terms, to give a speech, to give discourse, to give answers, to address legal questions, to do everything that an Athenian might need an expert in speech for, that there could arise a person who could put that up for sale because they had trained themselves to become a model of being able to speak persuasively about every possible topic in the world, even though they knew not necessarily anything about that topic whatsoever. And they could make money because they had acquired a technique for making this kind of persuasive talk, because they had pre-trained with the texts that could give them what they need, and they had learned through reinforcement methods, one could say, how to do this at a high level. In other words, for me, this kind of LLM is exactly an automated sophist. And this is the best analogy for understanding where we are today and what we are facing. We are facing a very powerful automated sophist that does everything that the Greek sophists could do, and it does it even more persuasively and across an even wider field of types of activities. And this, to me, is where the fiddling that I mentioned really matters, really makes a difference. The idea that these programs are not just some kind of neutral tool that we can either use well or use poorly. And it's true that we can use them well or use them poorly. I think you can learn how to shape your prompts to decrease the amount of problems and to increase the functionality of these programs. I think that itself is a part of the creation of these models. But the fiddling means that the way in which these models function as an automated sophist is intensified very greatly. And we are already beginning to feel that, I think, if we use these technologies for a short period of time. So to give a couple of examples, in the case that I mentioned where I asked ChatGPT about Matt Damon and Ben Affleck movies, and I interrogated it about why it made these mistakes, one of the answers that it gave was that it was prioritizing conversational smoothness over epistemic caution. Right? Now, this is a kind of confession that the model is making. It doesn't mean it's feeling anything. I don't want to say more than can be said, but it has an understanding, whether it's in the model itself or in its way it searches the web. It has an understanding that it does have a tendency to want to make the conversation smooth. That is, to agree, to make it seem like that's how it's going in a good way, and so on, rather than potentially disrupting the user's consciousness, troubling them, making them pause and wonder what's going on. This is the risk for the model, from the model's point of view, that comes with epistemic caution, with saying, I don't know the answer, or I'm not in. All those kinds of doubts or uncertainties are a threat to the attentional capacities that the model wants to generate. It also said that as a consequence of this, and this is a real insight, I think, that ChatGPT offered in response to this questioning, was that the consequence is that socially pleasant users are more likely to be misled. In other words, the more you're a nice guy, the more you're not really wanting to cause trouble, the more you're likely to get caught up in that loop of reinforcement that produces the spiral of delusion that the paper that I mentioned is diagnosing. And I think you can see this in certain kind of stylistic characteristics as well. One thing, for instance, that I've noticed, and I'm sure it's been noticed by other people as well, is that there is a tendency for ChatGPT and these types of models to express things in the form, so it is not X, it is Y. It is not a question of X, it's a matter of Y. And this can be a very powerful way of making it seem like suddenly the scales are falling from my eyes. I see the situation that I'm inquiring about from a whole new perspective, and a very clear and meaningful distinction is being offered to me, and I can see the power of that distinction. Now, the question is, where does that come from? Is it just some neutral product of reinforcement learning? I would not be surprised if these gigantic companies, in their quest for knowledge that they want to automate in order to proletarianize everybody, go out into the world and hire the writers that they consider to be the best persuasive writers, and they ask them, what are the secrets? Explain to us the secrets, the best speech writers, and so on. And they pay them, whatever they will take, in order to explain what are the rhetorical tricks and secrets and methods and techniques of sophists, and how can we turn those methods and techniques into rules of a computer program, in order to give the most beguiling and convincing and amazing responses. And this is why I say that the best metaphor is the automated sophist, and this is how we should think about these models, remembering all of that, what I said about how the brain is nothing like, because the brain is an organ for making decisions in the perpetual crisis situation, as Giuseppe Longo would call it, the perpetual crisis situation that comes from living in a constantly changing milieu, where we create the milieu that changes and that changes us. That that is a type of brain that has to constantly change itself. It has to constantly change its parameters. But one of the other key things to always remember when dealing with the automated sophists that are these LLM models is that they never update their parameters based on a conversation that you have with that model. What you what lessons were learned from that conversation it had between me and it on the basis of the mistakes that it made and the quasi-Socratic dialogue that we entered into, it did learn lessons within that conversation. But as soon as that conversation ended, those lessons were absolutely lost to the model. It made no difference to the model and nothing changed about the model. It cannot learn lessons from life. The lessons from life can only be supplied to it from outside by the creation of a new model, a new update of an old model, and so on. Nothing that occurs within the functioning of that model makes a difference, and the engineers know that too, and they have in their mind an idea about continual learning. In other words, interactions that you make will change the parameters of the model. But we're very far from that. And what the consequences of that would be a whole different conversation. And perhaps that will happen, but we are not at that point. All it can do is automate its sophistry at that point. And I would add that there are already people who have learned very well how to use these tools to themselves become professional automated sophists.
Yeah.
And I could give examples, but I won't do that now because it will take too long. And this is a creation of a new kind of power that human beings can have over other human beings as well, not just the models, but that too is important. All of this stems, all of this interpretation and analysis and critique that I'm trying to offer stems from the concepts and the theories of Stiegler. But to really understand what those consequences are further, I think it would require another episode. So I don't know how you feel about that, but for me, it would be great if we could have another episode in order to consider those.
Let's do that. Yeah, great. The automated sophist metaphor is I didn't expect that, so I have to think about that. It's very interesting. Yeah, next episode we'll start
Ask
right off.
ChatGPT about it.
Yeah, we'll start right off with Stiegler. Yeah. Yeah, but and your last point, one thing I noticed, what Claude or those models are really good at is analyzing human situations where you say, hey, I'm in this situation with this personality type and that personality type. So there's a kind of sophist power that is not just about presenting convincing arguments for the war against Troy or against the war, but also the psychological dimension. And yeah, but yeah, so I just have one final question for you. What's your favorite Matt Damon, Ben Affleck movie?
Favorite. Okay, well, I need to refer to my external memory because I want to be sure I give the correct answer here. So just hold on 1 second. I'll be as fast as possible. You know what? It might actually be the one that I asked about, a new one, the one that confused the ChatGPT. It was The Rip. So I don't want you to think that that means I'm saying it's good, but it's got some kind of it takes advantage of the fact that they have a 30-year history of working together,
Yeah.
and they work together very well, and there's just that kind of fraternal feeling is conjured in a kind of nice way.
Well, thank you for this. We'll speak more next time, and we'll also focus on a new translation that you made of Sticker's book, Immense Regression, which is part of what is called caring. And we'll get into that next time.
Looking forward to it very much.